Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus. My name is Amber Elias, and joining me for this News Focus episode is Greg Waldron, FlightGlobal's Defense Managing Editor. Hi, Greg.
Hi, good to be here, Amber.
Let's take a look at the top aviation stories this week on FlightGlobal. French investigators say a vintage Douglas DC-3 stalled and recovered at low altitude during a 2022 airshow rehearsal after control passed to its 85-year-old captain. Despite prior medical concerns, including impaired spatial awareness, he had been cleared fit to fly. The event raises serious questions about how well standard medical exams detect declines hazardous to safe piloting. An Airbus A320, operated by Air Arabia Maroc, descended to just 41 feet above sea level after takeoff from Catania Airport, when the captain applied nose-down inputs during the initial climb. Investigators revealed the crew failed to enter takeoff performance speeds into the flight management system, disabling climb pitch protections and contributing to the dangerously low altitude. Latvian carrier SmartLynx has shut down all commercial operations earlier this week, only a month after being divested by its former owner, Avia Solutions Group. The company filed for legal protection on 28 October, but concluded that its financial and business outlook left no viable path to continue operations. As part of its 100-year anniversary celebrations, Lufthansa plans to repaint 6 different aircraft types, including the Boeing 747-8 and Airbus A380, in a special centenary livery. This follows the debut of the scheme on an upcoming Boeing 787-9, with further repaints expected through autumn 2026. Boeing has won a contract from the U.S. Special Operations Command worth $271 million to deliver 5 MH-47G heavy-lift helicopters, a version of its Chinook family tailored for special operations. The MH-47G adds enhancements such as extended-range fuel tanks, a strengthened airframe, and advanced avionics, reinforcing Boeing's heavy-lift rotorcraft commitments. Greg, you've been on the road recently at the 2025 Dubai Air Show, where you were at a Rostec press conference discussing further refining the Sukhoi Su-57 fighter. Russia doesn't always get to attend these kind of international events. How important was it for them to be there?
I think for Russia, it was a really big deal that they got to go to Dubai because I think it's the first time. They used to have a big presence at Farnborough. That's ended with sanctions. They used to be at Paris. That's over with as well. Singapore. And this is the first time I've seen them at a big show, definitely after the invasion of Ukraine and maybe even before. So, they don't really get around that much these days. And so it was a real interesting opportunity to catch up with them and kind of try to get their perspective on things.
And I know at the press conference, they had an idea that how they wanted to do it. And they were effectively feeding journalists questions, would you say?
Yeah, that's correct. They asked me to send some questions beforehand. And as a reporter, I really don't like doing that. But I sent some talking points, okay? So just to kind of get in the door. And I show up and it's a very packed room. It's, there's loud rock and roll music from the food stand next door. And there's all these TV cameras. And so I find a seat. And the comms guy comes up and says, Greg, your questions are too hard. And I'm like, what? And he says, yeah, he'll kill me. I'm Sergei Chemezov, the head of Rostec, if you ask this stuff. And I'm like, okay, I didn't commit to anything. And then he hands me a slip of paper with a very kind of banal question that, frankly, nobody would ask. So, and I looked around the table and all the other reporters had a similar slip of paper. So that's one of my, I have the slip of paper in my hand right now, and it's one of my souvenirs from the show.
And can you tell us what the slip of paper says?
All right, I will. It says flight, and it's on hotel stationery. What do you think are the most important advantages of Russian products for international customers? Suffice to say, that wasn't on my original list of talking points for Rostec.
No, that is quite a suggestive question, and I'm sure that the one that they would love to give you an answer to. But what did you ask instead, and what was the tone of the press conference with the other journalists?
Well, curiously, we had some real heavy hitters in there. We had, Reuters was there, Bloomberg, some top aviation publications along with FlightGlobal. And all of the questions were hard. So people were hitting him about things like, how are you going to export aircraft amid sanctions? What's your status with specific programs? Because so many resources have gone into the war against Ukraine that I think it's really kind of put Russian aircraft developments on the back burner. That's basically it, like status of programs, sanctions. And of course, the guy speaking to us was Sergei Chemezov, and he's an old buddy of Putin's from the 1980s. He's the head of Rostec, and he comes across, he's a very, kind of avuncular kind of guy, smiles a lot, jokes around a lot. And according to him, everything's going great. They're adapting well, they're modifying their aircraft, they're working on new things. But again, you have to take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure they've got a very specific message that they wanted to communicate at the Dubai Air Show because they so rarely get the opportunity to have such a large international stage. And I'm sure a lot of the international press, like yourself, and Bloomberg, etc., don't get access to people specifically working in Russia at the moment.
Yeah, certainly. And to answer your question about what I specifically asked him, my question I asked him, what are about international prospects for the Su-35? Because there's reports that the Indonesian Su-35 deal that's been out there for years might still happen, although I'm very skeptical. And there's also a New York Times report that Vietnam might buy the Su-35, and I've only seen that in the New York Times. But he didn't touch the Su-35 question. And I asked him a follow-up question about how, if you even make some sales overseas, you sell aircraft, how are you going to support these aircraft with sanctions? And he ignored that question. So I'm not sure what his perspective is on that.
No, I mean, I think we can all infer perhaps what the support system would look like for that. Do they actually have any customers for the Su-57 fighter?
Well, the Su-57 is operated in very small numbers by the Russian Air Force. And apparently it really hasn't been much of a game changer over Ukraine. There was even a UK think tank that put out a report stating that Russia's actually scared to operate this thing near the front lines with Ukraine because they fear it'll get shot down. And then, whatever technology's in there might get compromised. So it's operated in small numbers by the Russian Air Force, which is not ideal because with these programs, you really want to have large production numbers to drive down your unit costs. Supposedly, Algeria has ordered 12 Su-57s, but that's something that I think people believe has happened, but I still am not 100% sure. And Chemezov certainly wouldn't comment on any specific customer stuff. He was very tight-lipped about naming specific countries.
And Greg, did they mention anything about the Su-75? I know that they made a lot of noise about it back in 2021.
Yeah, that was a huge focus for the Russians in 2021. They had this big pavilion with a full-size mock-up of this single-engine stealth fighter dubbed the Su-75. So the twin engine is the Su-57, which we've been talking about. Single engine is Su-75. The idea was a cheap stealth aircraft for the developing world. But this year, it was very much downplayed at the Russian stand. There was certainly no mock-up. But Chemezov said things are well in hand, that it's moving forward. They're going to mass produce it, and a test flight will happen at some point. But again, I'll wait and see, and then we'll decide then.
And are we expecting to see the Russian contingent at the Singapore Air Show in February?
I would be surprised if they show up in Singapore because they weren't there for the last show. But one never knows. I think the Israelis will be at the Singapore Air Show, but I'd be surprised if the Russians turned up. The Chinese, however, will probably be at the Singapore Air Show. They're becoming a lot more prominent at the air shows these days.
And it'll be really interesting to see if they reveal any more about some of their programs that they're keeping quite a tight lid on at the moment.
Yeah, the Chinese are interesting. We had that fight between India and Pakistan, several months ago in May before the Paris Air Show. And of course, the supposed star of this was a Chinese missile called the PL-15, which is a long-range air-to-air missile. And supposedly this thing was very effective against Indian Air Force aircraft. And so what I've noticed at the shows is that when the Chinese have models on their stand, they very prominently label the PL-15E. This is the export version of the PL-15. So they really are quite brazen about promoting that and highlighting that.
Yeah, very interesting if they'll bring that to Singapore as well.
Yeah, certainly. I suspect they might. They'll certainly bring it in model form.
Another bit of news that came out during the Dubai Air Show was that the US have approved the sale of Lockheed Martin F-35 fighters to Saudi Arabia. This is a deal that Riyadh had long sought to secure. How did Lockheed Martin respond to the order of reportedly 48 units?
Yeah, I was actually at the Lockheed briefing right after that news came out. And of course, that was the first thing that came up. And Lockheed really couldn't say much about it because, again, this is still in the realm of government-to-government discussions, Trump speaking with, the ruler of Saudi Arabia. So it was one of those things that Lockheed really didn't want to touch. But they, of course, want to talk about more things like more in general terms about the capabilities of the aircraft and what they're doing in that program. They also wouldn't be drawn on the UAE's potential to get the F-35. Some years ago, the UAE was approved by F-35, but then it was placed under review in the US, and now that's basically gone cold. So, yes, there's a few things, but Lockheed, again, being a corporate, they don't want to get in between the governments on something like this.
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, they are looking to sell planes, aren't they? And it's not really up to them for geopolitical reasons, but they're just there to produce the aircraft.
Yeah, certainly. Producers, like, in the case of Russia with, talking to Chemezov at Rostec and Lockheed Martin, I mean, very different organizations. But one thing I've observed over the years again and again is that they really don't want to get, as they put it, to the left of their customer. You don't want to come out and make some remark, because then, of course, the customer could come down like a ton of bricks. And also around some of these defense deals, there's a lot of secrecy. There's a lot of secrecy, not only about technology, but also about the cost of the program as well. I mean, it's all very sensitive kind of stuff. So getting these little details can be quite difficult. But, you just have to keep trying and keep asking. And occasionally you get something really interesting.
No, absolutely. That's always our job, always asking the questions. Greg, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the podcast.
Great to be here, Amber.
FlightGlobal Focus is your essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listeners can get a discount to a new subscription to FlightGlobal with the code FGPodcast. Terms and conditions apply. If you listen on Spotify, leave us a comment and let us know what you think of the show, and if there are any topics you want our journalists to look into. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.